There are a lot of young people that are taking on some of these new forms of media. You know, my panelist, my co-panelist, is an example of that because just like with mobile phones, laptops, and other newly introduced digital hardware, you find that Africa has been quicker to take those on because there's been no existence of more standard forms of media or communication to begin with. So I think it's a double-edged sword. There's a lot to anticipate. It's good to be optimistic, of course, but the economic side of it has got a part to play, and we'll just have to wait and see.
So I guess I can pick up from there. Yeah, I think the opportunities for Africa to leapfrog the rest of the world in terms of infrastructure are paramount and clear. And I guess there is a little bit of a bottleneck around hardware distribution, but hardware is not really a competitive game that much anymore, and that's going to become less and less the case. Hardware will become increasingly commoditized. The value is moving towards the software for sure, and the content continues to rule. So I think that that's the only real barrier in terms of content creation is around the hardware from an African perspective. But I don't think that barrier is going to last that much longer. I think again, with so many cloud services emerging where people don't even necessarily need to own hardware to be able to access creative tools to create content, it's just a matter of time. So I definitely think that there's a huge opportunity for Africa in the space. And, necessity is the mother of invention. And, as Eugene was saying, because we're not encumbered with legacy systems and legacy processes. So I think that based on the economic opportunities that will come from the space, that this will take off much more quickly across the continent than, it will happen very rapidly.
Okay, thank you. We see through the success of the Comic-Cons and attraction an interest for the Black superheroes. Why this phenomenon today?
I guess I can start with that one. I think the world is in a different place than it was in 20 years ago or even 15 years ago, because I guess the whole social change that has ushered in more discussions around representation has caused glaring realization that for the longest time people have been seeing the same color people and the same nationality of people on their screens and in their comic books and in their music for the longest time. And I think it was inevitable that Africa or African stories or African narratives would slowly creep into the forefront because of the general fatigue that was experienced, or that these social changes or social movements around representation brought people to notice. And as someone who actually holds an African comic book convention, long before the release of Black Panther, we had the opportunity to see the rise of indigenous superheroes and intellectual property that just burst onto the scene long before the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Black Panther phenomenon. And I feel as though even though we were enjoying that, there was still a one-sidedness, that it was still unilateral, and that it was only the types of faces that you see here and only the types of stories that you see here. So in actual fact, the whole issue of representation wasn't really answered. But in the same way that the world and globalization is turning everything into this cultural melting pot, it's going to become more and more apparent. I think we've seen it happen with television shows such as Black Lightning, for example, and Batwoman and other intellectual property where African superheroes or African faces have taken the forefront in pop culture and that kind of media. So it's an interesting phenomenon, and it's definitely much like comic books and television are a form of literature. They say, does literature reflect society, or does society reflect literature? So it's one of those things where it's a back and forth between the social movements or the social evolution of people and the evolution of the literature itself, the comic books and the superheroes, and the appreciation for different languages as the world begins to appreciate that the dominant Western languages aren't the only ones, or the dominant Western cultures aren't the only ones. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, Dele, maybe you can react to that.
Yeah, it's a strange question in some regards, but I understand why you're asking it. I mean, from my perspective, there's always been a demand for Black superheroes. And in fact, the concept of a superhero kind of comes from African culture and concepts historically. If you really look at African mythology and mysticism, it's all stories about superheroes with superpowers. And, this is the concept and framework from which the pantheons of gods have emerged. Similarly, in the Greek tradition, I mean, when you look at stories like Thor and Loki, these are superheroes, right? But they were gods referred to in the Greek culture, and this originally comes from Africa. So there's always been a demand for African superheroes. It's just not been a demand that has been met in recent times in modern 20th century media for all the reasons that we're all too painfully aware of. So I think what Black Panther did, though, was show the economics of Black demand for Black superheroes. And I think this is what the world is awakening to, and this is what the media institutions are awakening to now, is that the demand, the economic demand and economic potential for Black superheroes is phenomenal. I mean, Black Panther is the largest selling single superhero franchise ever, which that's pretty phenomenal when you really think about it. So I think all that's changing is really the economics, the social struggle, that is at the heart of, the reason why we don't get so much representation of Black heroes. I think obviously is a critical point, and I agree with Eugene completely there. But I think that that's more about the relationship between the media machinery, 20th century media machinery, the dysfunctional relationship that it has had with Africa and African culture. But, I think there's a change in consciousness now, and so all of those factors are very material, but I think the backdrop is that the demand has always been there. It's just only now we are finally in a position where we're able to facilitate that demand ourselves with the tools and technologies of today.
Okay, thank you. So how do you see the use of African myth and magic in the global creative industry? Will the future be Afro-punk, Afro-futurist, Afro-fantasy, etc.? Maybe today you can go.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part of your question.
The last part is, will the future be Afro-punk, Afro-futuristic, Afro-fantasy, etc.?
Oh yes, yeah. I've got a very strong connection with that whole idea. I think it's very dynamic, and I think there's an element of it all which is about the perception of African characters as being either less than human or superhuman only because of some kind of augmentation. And what I mean by that is there are numerous cases in which you look at superheroes or fictional characters that are of African descent, and how much they're either completely incapacitated, and I'll use the example of a character called Cyborg from the DC universe, where he's less than a human being, and that's what makes him special. And then you've got another example of a character, say Black Panther, who is superhuman, but only because of a supernatural force and a drug, for lack of a better word. So I've noted that there's a big dilemma
Whoa. 1 second.
Oh, sorry. Just
That's
you
all
can
right.
go ahead.
Yeah, so I was saying there's this big conflict of how to represent African fictional characters in the same way that you would have a Superman who is simply great because he's great, you know. And I think, yes, the future it does have a lot to offer. There is a lot out there in which African Afrofuturism or African mysticism or myths play a role. And yes, there will be demand for the mythological stories that are untold about all sorts of deities and that are, you know, of African origin. But the one thing that I've noticed a large community on social media has become very sensitive to is the depiction of African characters, either in a position of extreme physical or social lack and needing an external force to kind of make them human enough or more than human. So one thing that I do admire about the potential of Afrofuturism and the depiction of what I call cyberpunk culture mixed together with urbanized African cultures, there is something that I appreciate, which is there's a potential for Africans to be seen as extremely sophisticated. As much as I've mentioned some good and bad case studies, they are, examples that I actually look forward to seeing more of. For example, the character of Shuri in the Black Panther, and how she's depicted as just a sophisticated young African who's as intelligent as a Tony Stark or a Bruce Banner. And I'm all for that kind of representation, more of that kind of depiction of African characters within the Afrofuturist framework. There are also ideas that I've seen. I think there's a gentleman in Washington. I think his name is Jean-Louis. Yeah, Jean-Louis. He makes an African space opera graphic novel. And I love the idea of him showing African people as being sophisticated enough to come up with their own means of interstellar travel and exploration. And I see those different types of paradigms just being explored, but there is one that I'm definitely more in favor of, which shows African fictional characters as a reflection of just African people, where we're sophisticated, intelligent, and independent. And I hope it goes beyond the depiction of, the broken man, the broken African man, or the broken Black man kind of depiction, where there's some sort of lack or brokenness, which is only fulfilled by, either a drug or some sort of machinery. So that's my view of it. In general, I'm interested to hear my counterparts' ideas.
And Dele, you're mute, so you can go.
Yeah, sorry. I agree with Eugene. I would say, that is in many ways the whole purpose of fiction, and we're seeing this increasingly more today. I think the purpose of writing these stories is to address these issues exactly, and this is where comics, particularly, have been really powerful in the past, in terms of, literally they were being used as propaganda instruments to create myths and to debunk myths. But So we are working on it. We have a project that we have introduced with the world's first crypto comic. I think what I want to get to, and I agree with Eugene, although I think for me it's actually about going further than that. It's not. I mean, there's no debate, or I mean, I suppose there is among certain circles, but there should be no debate as to whether Africans have the sophistication and to be able to develop our own innovations, our own technologies, our own concepts. We've been doing this historically. We've been in this rut over the last few centuries because of very specific reasons. And I think that for me, part of what we are trying to do with our project is decolonize people's minds. That's, I think, the most important part of these storytelling frameworks and these mediums, is to decolonize our mind and denormalize this idea of depravity and incompetence, because that is not our history. You know, you look at our history as a people, you look at the great achievements of Kemet. We gave the world civilization, and we gave the world science and technology and innovations. And you look at our metal age, it started before the metal age started anywhere else. We have always been at the forefront of technology. Even in the modern world, if you look at the contributions of Africans in the Americas, in Europe, to the forefront innovations, Hidden Figures is a great example of that. How an African mathematician was able to play a critical role in putting American astronauts on the moon. So this narrative about the lack of sophistication or a lack of advancement is fictitious. That is the great fiction. So for me, I think in many ways, the purpose of these tools and technologies is to be able to tell our story in our own way and write our own place in it. And I think that the world really needs this. So, for example, in the story that we've created with Meta Knights, which is the world's first crypto comic, so we have pioneered this space. It's not the first African comic. We are the world's first crypto comic to basically use blockchain technology to enable storytelling. And in many ways, when we look at the arc of our story, in many ways, is that there is a battle between Eastern powers and Western powers to control the world. And it's basically controlled through these cyber vampires who exist in this digital world, or we have a digital world and a physical world. The digital world is like the digital twin of the physical world, and it's overrun by these cyber vampires called fangs who suck people's data so they can enslave them in the real world. And they're at war with the bats who are in the East, who are basically doing the same thing. They both want total control. But the interesting thing is that they're both trying to create a super AI. And they believe that whoever creates that AI first will gain control over both realms. Now, in our story, we then have a series of an African-centric hero group of hackers, of coders, who are working with this secret African order called the Digitarian Priesthood to create to prevent the fangs and bats from taking over the world. But the really important point that I want to make in terms of this conversation that we're having is that the Meta Knights are basically looking to create a new type of AI, an AI that is centered around humanity, ecology, and digital human rights. And this, I believe, is where we are at. There's a perspective that we as Africans bring to the technological discussion that is missing from the whole industry right now. And it's a critical perspective that is needed, because I think when it comes to this issue of humanity, we have the first say, we have the last say, because we're where it started. So I'm really passionate about the input and the imagination that Africans and people of African descent bring to this technology conversation is essential to what the world needs now to get out of the rut that we find ourselves in, with a decaying planet, with decaying societies and decaying social systems that are a result of what we've seen of hundreds of years of just pillaging and exploitation and ignoring this central African theme and story that needs to be at the forefront of how we talk about the progress of the world.
Yeah, well, I think.
Sorry, I got. It's a little train that my colleague is playing on our project. You can play it. It's literally a few seconds. Go on. There we go. Yeah. There we go.
Okay, thank you. So maybe Eugene, you want to react to that, or I go to the next question?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to add to that and say the stories that we put out are not being put out into a world that is it's not a blank canvas that we're entering our submissions, you know, as African storytellers. We're entering into an environment where there are dominant voices, and the dominant voices have always been have always been owned by the Western elite, and it's easy to forget that we, as the African educated elite, the Africans who've gone to school abroad and learned about the various contributions that African people have made in technology and inventions and so on, we are a very small minority who are actually aware of it. And because the people who own media as we know it have the loudest voice, it explains why there's so many misconceptions about what Africa is like. It's actually very ironic that as I was talking about participating in this event, I had reactions from certain people saying, "Wow, do you actually have the equipment, or do you actually have internet in that part of the world for you to participate in this kind of thing?" And that's an age-old story. That's something that's happened to just about. It's something that every African has encountered, at least every African with the capacity or opportunity to speak on some of these forums or study abroad. And the point that I wanted to drive home is that it's very apparent to us as a minority that we're just as equipped or just as sophisticated as the rest of modern civilization. But unfortunately, the Western narrative in itself doesn't support that. I'll draw back to a small bit of the movie Black Panther, where the CIA agent is asked what he knows about Wakanda, and he says, "A small country, nomadic herders, nothing much there." And that was a small quip at how the broader global community views Africa and Africans. Very basic people, yet to catch up, minding our own business, herding cattle, and so on. And I think the strength in the voices of individuals like, Dele and others across the continent, people like Ayodele Elegba and so on, creating these stories that challenge the status quo. Because for the longest time, I mean, media will forever be tainted by things such as blackface and the depiction of, Black and brown people, since time immemorial, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. But the beauty of it is that the minority is challenging that, and eventually, because of the stories that come from the West that are becoming somewhat stale or repetitive, they're forced to look at what we have to offer and forced to show respect to African civilization, African history, and African intelligence as an individual thing. So there's that journey and that war of attrition, as we're trying to change not only a fictional narrative, but a real world narrative that has been created by media over centuries. And that's the dynamic that exists.
Okay, thank you. Dele, you want to react? Or we have a question in the chat?
Yeah, I would like to just kind of throw one thing in with this. I mean, I completely agree with Eugene. I think it goes beyond media, though. I think, for me, with our project with Mennonites, we basically are using it to address what we see as three evils, the three big evils that are holding the world back right now. And the first of those is industrialized climate destruction. The planet is life as we know it is at threat. And we only know of life being here on Earth at the moment, but that is at threat from industrialized climate destruction. So that's the first big evil. The second big evil is surveillance tyranny. And for us, this is really the core of our mission. We have an NGO, the Internet Foundation, that we founded back in 2013, campaigning for universal digital rights as an extension of human rights. For us, humanity is ultimately about, when we talk about humanity, we actually go so far as to say hue, as in color, is what makes humanity. We are a melanated species. Which brings us to the third great evil, which is for us really the kind of primary one, which is this white supremacy, this white supremacist terrorism that African people have been subject to for the past 400-500 years. Certainly in a fleeting sense, and concentratedly, certainly over the last 150-200 years. So it is in that context, that is the backdrop in which we compete. And I agree, it is a war of thoughts, it is a war of ideas, it is a war of concepts. But white supremacy is a concept, and it is an idea. It is a fictitious idea, it is a fictitious construct, but it is a dominant one. So yeah, there is a fight and battle for that. But for me personally, I believe that my focus and my interest is in the African mind, because I think we have an identity crisis as a people, and that is based on this misalignment between what we think of ourselves and what is projected onto us. And that's always going to result in mental health issues when there's a gap between how you see yourself and how the world keeps telling you that you are. But the most important thing, I'm less interested in how the rest of the world sees us right now. I'm just mostly interested in how we see ourselves, because it's only in how seeing ourselves in a healthy manner that we will become healthy, and that we will start to use these narratives to reconstruct ourselves and our societies and our relationships with the rest of the world.
Thank you. So the question in the chat, it's up if you want to react.
Can you read it out to us what the question is?
Okay, so let's go. The question is how you will see the transmedia implementation of your comics IP for series or video games, any project. Oh. How you will see the...
I'm happy to take that, Eugene. You get that?
Sorry, I'm trying to catch up with it as well.
I can take it in the meantime.
The implementation of your comics IP or series or video games. Any projects? Oh, okay, I can take that.
Sure.
In our case, we've got a video game project that we've been working on for the past 3 years, and it does happen to affect some of the topics we've talked about today. In fact, all of them. And what I like about the opportunity to do this and to take a medium that's not particularly quite exhausted within Africa. I'm working from Zimbabwe, by the way, and to use it as a narrative tool and an educational tool. I like what Dele mentioned about COP26 and the environmental impact that Western civilizations have had, the negative environmental impact they've had among many different things. This game and this platform has multiple social themes. Amongst them are your typical themes of dealing with corruption within our own communities as African people, reacting to neo-colonialist forces coming in the form of multinational companies, for example. But the beauty of it is interweaving all of that with strong storytelling, because in the end, as artists, we're not primarily activists. We're entertainers. We're storytellers. And one of the three pillars that we use at our studio is just narrative. We believe in design, we believe in narrative, and we believe in gameplay. Those three coming together. And if at any point it becomes purely an activist-driven thing, then it's not purely art anymore, and that's a bit problematic according to us. So how we want to use this new technology, especially in game development, is in managing all of these themes and respecting them as themes, and themes that affect characters that tell stories. And people want to hear a good story. Yes, there can be a lesson within the story, but the entertainment should never become a lecture or propaganda or any of those things. So yeah, I see a lot of potential for comic books and video games, and the application of it is going to become easier and easier for those of us with access. And by that, I mean, there are those among us with access to the internet, access to open source tools such as Unreal Engine and Unity, and so on. And the majority of us, to be honest, do not. But I see that there is an opportunity for us who do have access to those tools to exploit them at this very moment and begin to break new ground, just like Dele has with his crypto comic book, which is very impressive indeed. So one other layer that we're using is just the beauty of communicating through the internet and using a game to encourage social integration or cultural exchange within that environment without making it so apparent, without shoving it down anyone's throat. And that can only be done by having enough pull factors where your ideas or your concepts, and of course the actual product has to work. All of that draws people into your culture with a newfound sense of respect, because you've told them a respectful story and you've respected their ideas whilst sharing your own. So that's how I see the potential that lies ahead using this new media that exists.
Okay. Yeah. No. So I think you can see up on the screen. We've been working on a video game based on our series as well. And to be honest with you, I mean, the video game is just really kind of part of it. It's more about gamification. So, we're really focused on empowering people to, our whole story and lore is around, we call it like the Matrix meets Mr. Robot on the road to Wakanda. And that description is because the Matrix kind of gives you this two-world, physical world, digital world scenario. Mr. Robot is really about hacktivism and about these hackers who really can change the world and really do change the world. And Wakanda is obviously about, the Black liberation and the Black tech and the Black sort of advanced African society perspective. So, and I agree with Eugene completely. I think there are many interesting ways to gamify outcomes that we are trying to achieve. So in our ecosystem, we do a lot around data sovereignty, self-sovereignty, giving people tools to have ownership of their data, ownership of their identity. And so we can gamify these kind of activities where we incentivize people to do things that will drive better outcomes for themselves, for ourselves, for society as a whole. So I agree with that. I will say though, I think where I differ slightly is that I think it is about activism now. I think it is about, we're very clear we're launching a generative art NFT project next week. And for us, it's very clear when we talk to our community, life is not a spectator sport. We want people to be active. And I think that in this day and age, there's a new type of activism. It's, yes, people walk, march the streets and protest, that's fine. But digital activism, I think, is really essential because, I think that these are tools of propaganda. We are in an information war. This war has been going on for a very long while, particularly from an African perspective, where our myths, our culture, our heritage has been degraded and being presented as being unsophisticated and barbaric and all of this stuff. So there is a war that is going on around our culture. But where I do agree with Eugene, though, is that it has to be entertaining. But I don't think that these are mutually exclusive. I think something can be educational, can be informative, can be propaganda even. And I use that word deliberately in many ways because it is about, with a full understanding of the history of it and the relationship of it within public relations and advertising and in storytelling. When we're watching the Seven Commandments or stories of Moses and the flood, whether it's with Charlton Heston or whether it's with what's his name, the Australian guy, I can't even remember his name now. This is propaganda. That's the purpose of these things. They're done in entertaining manners, but they are propaganda. So I do feel that we need to be mindful and purposeful in terms of these content. Yes, it does need to be entertaining. I agree completely with that, but I don't think that that's at the expense of it being or confronting some of these myths, truths, and these myths that we are suffering from as a people kind of potently. So I just think, digital activism is really, we need our people to be active. And that is in terms of being creative. That's in terms of coding. I think we want to make people laugh and we want to make people feel good, but we want people to go out and do stuff. And that doesn't have to feel like work. It can be like play. We are introducing a really radically new framework within our gaming model, which is participate to earn. And so, just through participation, not necessarily even playing, but through participation, people will be able to earn income. And that income they'll be able to use to generate more income through crypto rewards and staking and pools and all of this stuff. So it is about uplifting, using gamification and storytelling and all of this stuff to lift people up. But that's an act of activism, and people need to be active in this new metaverse that we're going into if they're going to be free. You're not going to have freedom without activism. That's kind of. But I don't mean to sound contentious, and I don't mean to sound belligerent. But I do understand that we are in a hostile when it comes to media. And when it comes to African media, by default, we are in a hostile environment. And that goes to what Eugene was talking about earlier. So I completely agree with that. So we need to employ lots of tools in overcoming that hostility as a people.
Okay, thank you very much. We will need to end this talk, but thank you both for your intervention. It was really interesting too. So if you have any more questions, we can ask them later. So thank you again, and we will go to the next conference.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you very much.